They left her on the trail with a baby in her arms, the cold night pressing in like a death sentence. But he rode all night to find them, and it makes you wonder what kind of love or courage drives a man to risk everything for two souls the world had already given up on. The wind cut through the Colorado darkness like a blade, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. Out on the lonesome trail, where civilized folks had no business being after sunset, a young woman named Sarah clutched her infant son against her chest, her breath coming in ragged clouds that disappeared into the merciless night. She'd been walking for hours since they'd left her, those snake-hearted outlaws who'd decided a woman with a crying baby was more trouble than she was worth. Slowing us down, their leader had spat, tossing her meager belongings into the dirt. "Find your own way to town, lady. Maybe someone will take pity on you." But there was no town for 30 miles in any direction, and Sarah knew it. Her water was gone, her strength fading with each stumbling step. The baby little Matthew, barely 3 months old, had stopped crying an hour ago, and that silence terrified her more than his wails ever could. When babies go quiet in the cold, it usually means they're giving up the fight. I learned about Sarah's plight from a drifter, who'd witnessed the whole sorry scene from a distance. Too outnumbered to intervene, but decent enough to ride hard to the nearest settlement with word of what he'd seen. He found me at Murphy's saloon, nursing a whiskey and trying to forget my own troubles, when he burst through the doors with eyes wide as saucers. "There's a woman out there," he gasped, still catching his breath from his hard ride. "Young gal with a baby, left for dead by the Morrison gang. They dumped her on the Devil's Back Trail like she was nothing more than broken cargo." The whiskey turned to acid in my throat. I'd seen enough cruelty in my 32 years to know that some folks had ice water running through their veins instead of blood, but abandoning a mother and child to die in the wilderness? That crossed every line that decent people draw. I stood up so fast my chair toppled backward, the legs scraping against the saloon floor like fingernails on a coffin lid. The other patrons looked up from their cards and their drinks, sensing something significant was about to happen. But I was already heading for the door, my mind racing with calculations, distance, time, weather, and the slim chances that Sarah and her baby were still breathing. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you ride out into the night to save strangers, even if it meant risking everything? Because what happened next changed all our lives forever. My horse, a sturdy black gelding named Thunder, sensed the urgency in my movements as I threw the saddle across his back with trembling hands. The stable was dark except for the pale moonlight filtering through the gaps in the weathered boards, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward me like grasping fingers. "Easy, boy," I whispered, tightening the cinch with practiced efficiency. "We've got angels to chase down tonight." Thunder's ears flicked forward, understanding in that mysterious way horses have that this wasn't going to be an ordinary ride. This was life and death, and every second we delayed was another step closer to finding graves instead of survivors. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since the drifter had brought word of Sarah's abandonment, and storm clouds were building on the horizon like an army of dark spirits preparing for battle. I could smell snow in the air, the kind of late-season blizzard that could bury the trail under 3 feet of white death before morning. As we thundered out of town, hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground, I couldn't shake the memory that drove me forward like a man possessed. 7 years ago, my own sister had been caught in a storm with her newborn daughter, and I'd been too drunk and too selfish to ride out and help her. They found her body 3 days later, frozen solid, with the baby still clutched in her arms. I'd sworn on their graves that I'd never again ignore someone who needed help, especially a woman with a child. Some promises you make to the living, but the ones you make to the dead? Those are the ones that follow you into hell itself. The wolves were already singing their hunger songs from the ridgelines, their howls echoing across the wasteland like warnings from the underworld. They could smell weakness and desperation on the wind, and they knew that somewhere out in that frozen darkness, easy prey was stumbling through their hunting grounds. Thunder's hooves pounded out a rhythm against the hard-panned trail. Thud, 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 like a heartbeat racing against time. Each mile stretched before us like an eternity, and I found myself calculating and recalculating how long a woman could survive in this cold, how long a baby could last without proper warmth and shelter. The answer wasn't comforting. In weather like this, exposure could kill within hours, especially if you were already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. But I pushed those dark thoughts aside and leaned forward in the saddle, urging Thunder to greater speed. Would we reach her before the cold claimed another innocent life? The first sign of Sarah's passage came 3 miles out from town, a small blue baby blanket caught on a sagebrush, fluttering in the wind like a flag of surrender. I dismounted and picked it up, my heart clenching as I felt how soft it was, how carefully it had been knitted by loving hands. No mother drops her baby's blanket unless she's stumbling blind with exhaustion. Thunder snorted and stamped, his breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air as I tucked the blanket inside my coat. The trail ahead was treacherous, even in daylight. Loose rocks, hidden gullies, and patches of ice that could send an unwary traveler tumbling into darkness. For a woman carrying a baby, walking this path at night was like dancing on the edge of a cliff. 2 miles further, I found more evidence of her desperate journey. A crust of bread, half-eaten and abandoned beside the trail, where she'd stopped to rest. The bread was frozen solid now, but I could see the small bite marks where she'd tried to force herself to eat, probably knowing she needed strength, but unable to keep anything down due to fear and exhaustion. The hoofprints of the Morrison gang's horses were still visible in the mud, heading west toward the mountain passes where they had hideouts and escape routes. But those tracks diverged sharply from the smaller footprints, a woman's boots, size 6 or 7, walking unsteadily toward the southeast, toward nothing but wilderness and certain death. I followed those heartbreaking footprints through a landscape that looked like God had forgotten it existed. Jagged rocks thrust up from the earth like broken teeth, and the wind carved through the canyons with a sound like souls crying out in torment. In my mind, I could see her clutching little Matthew against her chest, stumbling forward on legs that barely held her weight, whispering prayers to a sky that seemed determined not to answer. The trail became harder to follow as the ground turned rockier, the footprints disappearing into patches of stone and reappearing yards later where softer earth allowed them to register. But I'd been tracking game and men for most of my adult life, and I knew how to read the signs that others missed: a scuffed rock here, a broken twig there, the faint impression where someone had braced themselves against a boulder. Then, just as I was beginning to fear I'd lost the trail entirely, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. Fresh blood drops on the rocks, small but unmistakable in the moonlight. Sarah was injured, probably from falls on the treacherous terrain, but she was still moving forward, still fighting for her baby's life, even as her own strength ebbed away like water through a broken dam. Thunder's ears suddenly pricked forward, and he whinnied softly, the sound horses make when they smell smoke. I stood in my stirrups, scanning the darkness ahead, and there it was, the faintest wisp of gray against the black sky. Someone had managed to build a fire, but was I already too late? The fire was more ember than flame when I found her barely enough heat to warm a coffee cup, let alone save 2 lives from the killing cold. Sarah sat hunched beside it like a broken bird, her back against a boulder, arms wrapped protectively around a bundle that I prayed still contained a living child. She didn't look up when Thunder's hooves announced my arrival, didn't even seem to hear me dismount and approach with careful steps, not wanting to startle someone who'd already endured more terror than most folks see in a lifetime. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold, her dark hair matted with ice, and her eyes held the glassy stare of someone who'd given up hope. "Ma'am?" I called softly, dropping to one knee beside her. "My name's Jake. I'm here to help." Her head moved slightly, like it took enormous effort just to acknowledge my presence. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. rough as sandpaper and faint as a dying breeze. "Don't let him die. Please. I don't matter. But Matthew. He's innocent. He deserves better than this." I could see the baby then, a tiny face peeking out from the ragged bundle of clothes and blankets. His skin had that waxy, bluish tint that comes just before the cold claims its victims, but his chest was still rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. Still alive, but hanging by a thread thinner than spider silk. "Neither of you is dying tonight," I said firmly, pulling my water flask from my saddle and holding it to Sarah's lips. "Drink. Small sips now, don't make yourself sick." The water was barely above freezing, but it might as well have been liquid gold from the way she received it. I shrugged out of my heavy coat and wrapped it around both mother and child, then set to work rebuilding the fire with dry wood I kept tied to my saddle for emergencies like this. Within minutes, proper flames were dancing against the darkness, throwing welcome heat and light across our small sanctuary. But even as I worked to warm them, my ears were picking up sounds that made my blood freeze in my veins. Hoofbeats in the distance, coming from the direction of the Morrison gang's trail. Multiple riders, moving with purpose through the night. They weren't just passing through, they were tracking someone. Sarah must have heard them too, because her grip tightened on the baby and her eyes widened with fresh terror. "They came back," she whispered. "They said they might, if they changed their minds about leaving witnesses." I reached for my rifle with steady hands, checking the action and making sure I had a clear line of sight down the trail. The Morrison gang had made their choice when they left a woman and baby to die in the wilderness. Now they were about to learn that some choices come with consequences. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and I knew our moment of peace was about to shatter like glass. The riders materialized out of the darkness like demons summoned from the pit, 5 men on horseback, led by Bull Morrison himself, a mountain of a man with dead eyes and a smile that could curdle milk. They rode with the casual arrogance of predators who'd never met anything they couldn't kill or intimidate, their hands resting easy on their gun butts as they surveyed our little camp. "Well, well," Bull called out, his voice carrying the mock friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Look what we got here, boys." Our little burden found herself a knight in shining armor. He spat into the fire, causing it to hiss and spit. "Course, that just means we got ourselves one more grave to dig." I stood slowly, rifle held loose but ready, keeping my body between the outlaws and Sarah. The baby had started crying thin, weak sounds that cut through the night air like accusations against every man who'd ever turned his back on innocence. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins like liquid lightning. "Seems like you boys took a wrong turn somewhere. This is a private camp, and you're not welcome." The other 4 riders spread out in a semicircle, trying to box me in. I recognized the tactic: surround your target, cut off escape routes, make them feel hopeless before you close in for the kill. It was smart strategy, if you were dealing with someone who planned to run. "Private camp?" Bull laughed, the sound like rocks grinding together. "Friend, everything west of the Missouri River belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it. And that little lady there? She's got something that belongs to us." "She doesn't belong to anybody," I replied, shifting my weight slightly to get a better angle on the man trying to flank me from the left. "And if you had any decency in your black hearts, you'd have helped her instead of leaving her to die like a dog." Bull's face darkened, and his hand moved closer to his pistol. "That's where you're wrong, cowboy. See, the lady there witnessed some business transactions that the territorial authorities might find interesting. Can't have loose ends walking around, telling tales to the wrong people." So that was it. Sarah hadn't just been abandoned because she was inconvenient. She'd been marked for death because she'd seen something she shouldn't have. These men hadn't come back out of some twisted sense of ownership. They'd come back to tie up loose ends, and that loose end included an innocent baby who'd never done anything worse than cry at inconvenient moments. The wind picked up, causing the fire to dance and throw wild shadows across the rocks. In the flickering light, I could see Sarah trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the boulder behind her, while clutching Matthew so tightly I worried she might hurt him. "Tell you what," Bull continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man offering a fair deal. "You ride away right now. Pretend you never saw us, and maybe you live to see another sunrise. Stay, and we'll bury you right next to her and the brat." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, and I knew that whatever happened next would echo through eternity. The first gunshot shattered the night silence like thunder splitting the sky, and everything erupted into chaos. I dove sideways, pulling Sarah and the baby behind the boulder, as bullets whistled through the space where we'd been sitting. My rifle barked twice in quick succession, and I heard one of the outlaws scream as my shots found their mark. "Stay down!" I shouted to Sarah over the deafening roar of gunfire. "No matter what happens, keep that baby's head covered." Thunder was dancing and rearing at the picket line, terrified by the noise but trained well enough not to bolt. I needed to reach him if we were going to have any chance of escape. Bull Morrison's voice boomed over the gunfire. "Burn them out, boys! Set the whole damn camp on fire!" I could hear them dismounting, moving to surround our position with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. These weren't just outlaws, they were killers, and they meant to finish what they'd started. A burning branch landed near Sarah's feet, thrown from one of the flanking riders. The dry grass caught immediately, sending up flames that illuminated our hiding spot like a beacon. We had maybe 30 seconds before the fire forced us into the open, where we'd be sitting ducks for their rifles. That's when desperation gave me an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal, probably both. I grabbed Sarah's arm and hauled her to her feet, the baby clutched against her chest. "When I say run, you head straight for my horse. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run like the devil himself is chasing you." I waited until the next volley of shots died down, then stepped out from behind the boulder with my rifle blazing. "Run!" I bellowed, laying down covering fire, as Sarah stumbled toward Thunder on legs that barely held her weight. Bullets buzzed around us like angry hornets, one of them close enough to burn a furrow across my left shoulder. Thunder stood steady as a rock as I boosted Sarah into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The baby was crying again, the thin, desperate wails of an infant pushed beyond endurance. But crying meant breathing, and breathing meant alive, and that was enough for now. We exploded out of the camp like a cannonball shot from hell, Thunder's powerful legs eating up the ground as more gunshots erupted behind us. I could hear Bull Morrison screaming orders, the thunder of pursuing hooves, the whistle of bullets cutting through the air around our heads. Sarah was slumping forward in the saddle, exhaustion and terror finally overwhelming her. I wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her upright, while using the other to guide Thunder through the treacherous terrain. Behind us, the pursuit was gaining ground. Their horses were fresh while Thunder was carrying double weight. Then, just as I thought we might actually outrun them, the worst possible thing happened. The baby's crying stopped, completely, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than all the gunfire in the world. I hauled back on Thunder's reins so hard the poor horse nearly sat down, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sarah was barely conscious, swaying in the saddle like a wheat stalk in a hurricane, but the deadly silence from the bundle in her arms had jolted me awake more effectively than a bucket of ice water. "Sarah," I shook her gently, trying to get her to respond. "Sarah, is the baby breathing?" But she was past answering. Her eyes rolled back in her head, running on nothing but maternal instinct and the last fumes of adrenaline. I slid down from Thunder's back and reached up to take the bundle from her arms. Little Matthew felt like a rag doll limp, cold and terrifyingly still. His tiny face had gone from pink to blue to a waxy gray that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. The pursuing hoofbeats were getting closer, maybe 5 minutes behind us at most. But I couldn't run with a dying baby. Couldn't keep moving when every second might be the difference between life and death for an innocent child who'd never asked to be born into this nightmare. I ripped off my shirt and wrapped Matthew against my bare chest, trying to share what body heat I had left. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on that tiny, still form, willing him to take another breath, to fight just a little longer. "Come on, little man," I whispered, rubbing his back with gentle circular motions the way I'd seen mothers do. "Don't you give up on me now. Your mama needs you to be strong, needs you to keep fighting." My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. Sometimes the only prayer worth saying is the one that comes from a heart that's breaking. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Matthew lay against my chest like a small cold stone, and I found myself remembering my sister's baby, the one I'd failed to save 7 years ago. History was repeating itself, and I was powerless to stop it. Then a flutter. So faint I thought I'd imagined it, but there it was again, the tiniest movement against my chest, followed by a sound like a kitten mewing. Matthew's eyes opened, unfocused, but alive, and he let out a cry that was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Sarah's eyes snapped open at the sound of her baby's voice, tears streaming down her face as she realized what had just happened. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice broken but filled with gratitude that made my chest tight. "Thank you for not giving up on him." But our relief was short-lived. The sound of pursuing horses was getting louder, and I could see torches bobbing in the darkness behind us. Bull Morrison and his remaining men weren't giving up. They meant to finish this, no matter how far we ran. I handed Matthew back to his mother and swung into the saddle behind them, wrapping my coat around all three of us. Thunder snorted and stamped, ready to run again, despite his exhaustion. Dawn was still hours away, but I could see something on the horizon that gave me hope. The faint glow of lights that might just be our salvation. The settlement of Cedar Springs materialized out of the dawn mist, like a vision from heaven. A handful of buildings clustered around a church steeple, smoke rising from chimneys, and the blessed sight of people already moving about their morning routines. Thunder's hooves drummed against the packed earth of the main street as we rode in like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, battered and bloodied but alive. Sarah had managed to stay conscious for the final push, clutching Matthew against her chest and whispering lullabies that mixed with prayers in a language older than words. The baby was breathing steadily now, his color returning to something approaching normal, though he'd bear the marks of this night for the rest of his life. People poured out of buildings as we clattered to a stop in front of the doctor's office, men in work clothes, women in aprons, children rubbing sleep from their eyes. They took one look at our condition and sprang into action with the kind of communal efficiency that only exists in small towns where everyone knows that survival depends on helping your neighbors. "Get Doc Martinez," someone shouted, "and heat some water. This woman's half dead from cold." Doc Martinez turned out to be a small, efficient man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen enough frontier medicine to know when not to ask questions. He took charge of Sarah and Matthew with professional calm, ushering them into his office while issuing rapid-fire instructions to his assistants. I was helping Sarah down from the saddle when the thunder of approaching hooves announced that our pursuers had finally caught up. Bull Morrison and 3 surviving members of his gang rounded the corner at full gallop, their faces twisted with rage and determination. But they weren't prepared for what they found. The good people of Cedar Springs had heard enough shooting and seen enough blood to recognize trouble when it rode into their town. By the time the Morrison gang reined in their horses, they were facing 24 armed citizens who'd formed a protective semicircle around the doctor's office. "That's far enough," called out the town marshal, a weathered man with steel-gray hair and a shotgun that looked like it had seen considerable use. "You boys got business in my town. You'd better state it quick and civil-like." Bull Morrison's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized the tactical situation had shifted dramatically against him. "We're tracking a murderer," he tried, his voice carrying far less authority than it had out on the trail. "That man there killed 2 of my boys in cold blood." The marshal looked at me, shirtless, bloody, but standing straight despite exhaustion. Then, at the doctor's office, where Sarah's grateful sobs could be heard through the open door. "Funny thing about murderers," the marshal said conversationally, "they don't usually ride all night to save dying women and babies." The standoff stretched for a long moment, tension crackling in the morning air like electricity before a storm. Then Bull Morrison made the smartest decision of his miserable life. With a curse that would have blistered paint, he wheeled his horse around and led his remaining men out of town at a gallop, disappearing into the Badlands where honest folks feared to follow. As the dust settled and the townspeople began to disperse, I finally allowed myself to believe that we'd actually made it. Sarah and Matthew were safe, warm, and alive. The nightmare was over. 6 months later, I received a letter written in careful schoolgirl script. Sarah had found work as a seamstress in Cedar Springs. Matthew was growing strong and healthy, and they'd both like me to visit sometime. She signed it, "Your grateful friends forever." Sometimes, the trails we ride lead us exactly where we need to go. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.